Hello and welcome back to the Single Malt Frontier, where we explore the edge of innovation in American single malt whiskey. Here on the show, we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Usually we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey is the conversations that we get to have along the way, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. I'm your host, Doug, or as I'm known around the internet, Demi Tastes. I'm joined today by three co-hosts for a round table. So I am joined by Phil, as usual, of the Ranger's Respite, and also Jake from Coming Whiskey and Germ from Freedom Malts. So real quick, everybody, could you just introduce yourselves, starting with Phil?
I'm a whiskey enthusiast and reviewer. I've been into the hobby for almost 9 years now. And I've been making videos on and off again for the last 5-6 years.
Awesome. And Jake?
All right, so I'm Jake. I live in Owensboro, Kentucky, the same city as Green River Distilling. I run the Coming Whiskey Instagram page and write for Drink Hacker. So if you're not familiar with Coming Whiskey, I search the public domain federal TTB website every morning, and I pull the interesting American whiskey labels that are still a couple of months or weeks off, and I post them and let you know where your dollars are going in the future. Adding to that content, I do spirits reviews, and I take a special interest in history books regarding American booze history, and I share that content on my Instagram page.
And Germ?
Well, Germ, Freedom Malts is my handle on Instagram, YouTube, all of that stuff. Huge whiskey enthusiast, all types of whiskey. American single malt specifically is more of my forte. But my whole goal and game and whatever is to I want to broaden people's horizons in the whiskey world. People that are stuck in whatever category they're stuck in, I like to spread that open a little bit, introduce them to things that they might like that they never thought they would. Also, host and creator of the Blind Sample Showdown. If you've ever caught that, super fun time. And also helps achieve the goal of to break people's boundaries, whiskey boundaries down. So
Awesome.
That's me.
I'm debating whether I should show all the comments and praise that we're getting right now, but rather than interrupt the momentum, I think I'll just keep going and we'll show some comments later. So before we sort of get into a more detailed introduction of everyone, I just want to sort of make the somewhat non-committal statement, but it feels really good right now. I'm going to call this the first episode of season 2 of this podcast. We've been doing this for we've been doing interviews on Single Malt Frontier, which was formerly known as the Demi Taste podcast, formerly known as the Whiskey Lodgecast. We've gone through a bunch of branding changes. We sort of settled all of that now. For about a year now, we've done 23 interviews with industry professionals, and a couple of influencers, a few bonus episodes here and there. We still do our just chatting streams every now and then. We are officially on Podbean, which means that we're days away from being on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever else you want to listen to this show, because I know sitting in front of your computer watching a bunch of talking heads isn't the most exciting thing. My favorite way to consume podcasts like this is actually audio only. So it's been kind of a shame that we haven't been on any audio podcast application so far. So I'm fixing that, and now feels like a good time to say we're starting anew, right? It is a new season. I've just come back from vacation. American single malt whiskey just passed a huge anniversary. That's why we're having this conversation today. 2 years ago, at the beginning of, was it beginning of July or beginning of August? Actually,
I think August.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, beginning of August, the TTB published their proposed rules for American single malt whiskey as a category. There was a public comment period, which lasted 2 months. That's standard procedure. And we thought, okay, after that public comment period, there's probably going to be some paperwork. It'll be a few months, maybe by November 2022, we'll have this definition formalized and published. However, 2 years later, we are still waiting on TTB to ratify that definition. We want American single malt whiskey to have a legal definition to protect what this category means to everybody who makes it. And we want you, all of our audience, to write in support of this definition There's links in the descriptions with a really easy form to fill out. And we're probably pretty much going to spend the rest of today as a love letter to this category to show you all why it is that we love it, what it is, what makes it so special, how far it's come in the last 2 years. So we'll start with a definition, but before that, since we have 2 new co-hosts, and this, by the way, is going to be another major thing that we're trying out in season 2. We'd like to sort of go back to the original vision for this podcast and have rotating co-hosts, because this whiskey is a community thing. I always wanted this podcast to be a community, to feel like a sense of community, and part of that is in bringing in a diversity of co-hosts. So I've invited Jake and Germ to occasionally join us to whatever topics are appropriate for their connections, their area of expertise, whatever makes sense. And there's a few other people as well who are interested in doing the same. So this season on Single Malt Frontier, you will see a more of a diversity of a cast of talking heads. Hopefully that adds more diversity to the perspectives here. We get to have better conversations, and this will just make the show better. So since Jake and Germ are new to the show, I want to have them introduce themselves in a little bit more depth. Starting with Jake, tell us more about what you do.
Well, like I said, my name is Jake. I run the Coming Whiskey Instagram page. Looking back, trying to figure out when it was I actually got into whiskey. Figuring was about between 7 and 8 years ago. I was always a craft beer drinker, but then started getting interested in whiskey when, so kind of a long story. My father passed away from cancer when I was 10 years old. And roughly 7 years ago, my mother told me that she saved the last bottle of bourbon that my father opened before he passed away in 1992. It was about a 3/4 full bottle of standard Maker's Mark. And she asked, "Do you want this?" And of course I did. 20-something years after my father passed away, I was holding a bottle of whiskey, the last bottle of whiskey that he opened before he passed, that he had glasses from. I took it and then realized I didn't know much about bourbon or whiskey, but I felt this connection to my dad through this bottle of whiskey, so I wanted to learn more. It was a way for me to connect with my dad 20-something years after his passing. And I picked up a book on American whiskey by Clay Rise in New York Times. And over the years, one book has turned into, as of today, 491. Been on a rampage of reading everything that I can about alcohol history, beverage alcohol history related to American history. So it started with a love of Kentucky bourbon. And then over time, I would read books, I would be exposed to more and more. And my interest morphed from Kentucky bourbon to just American whiskey in general. I like world whiskey, but American whiskey just hits home for me. And it eventually turned into an interest in American single malt. With my Instagram page, I will say that all this obsession that I have with the whiskey industry, it's all some big tribute to my dad in some way, I guess. But with my Instagram page, got interested in, for my own personal benefit, looking at what is coming on this free public domain federal website and seeing what whiskey labels are out there. And for those who may not know, every single beverage alcohol label sold in the United States, beer, wine, whiskey, Boone's Farm, everything before it goes to market, the brand is submitted to the federal government. The government makes sure there are things on the label that have to be there, and that there are not things that can't be there. Once the federal government says this label works, they post it to a public domain website that most people don't know that exists, nor do they care, and you don't end up there accidentally. You have to go looking for it. Even then, it's difficult to navigate. But the beauty is these labels hit this free public domain website weeks to months to a year before going to market. So it is this crystal ball into the future of American alcohol in general, but as I take it, American whiskey. So I take the labels that I think are interesting, things that I think people are going to care about, and I post it to an Instagram page where consumers get to see where their dollars are going. And it also gives the industry a chance to, one, get free publicity, and get feedback from consumers to see what interests them, what doesn't interest them. But it's a place for the industry in general to follow trends before ever going to market. So that is the main part of my account. And then it did develop into doing spirits reviews. While yes, I do review some of the major player distilleries, I take a special interest in the smaller craft distilleries. That's what I really love. I love Jim Beam and Wild Turkey as much as anybody else, but give me guys like Copperworks in Seattle every day of the week.
Yeah, awesome. Just a comment on the Cola website. It's very 90s as well. So even if you know it's there, cannot overstate how difficult it is to navigate. So Jake is doing a wonderful service by making those labels easily accessible on his Instagram. And if you're not following him, you should. And that goes for everyone on this call. So next up, Germ, could you tell us about yourself in a bit more detail?
Well, it's going to be awfully hard to follow that up. I'm not nearly as interesting. But the other thing I wanted to say is, Jake, yeah, you kind of ruined the fun on what's coming out. What's going to be coming out? I don't know. Go check Jake's page. We got it all right there. But no, it's super fun to see that stuff coming out. Yeah, I think you do a really good service as far as letting people know what's interesting coming out and market trends showing and all that kind of stuff. It's really neat to see, over the years, who is coming out with whiskey styles that may not be their norm. And it's kind of cool. But as far as me, I've been drinking whiskey for quite a while, but I never got into the exploration of it. It was always Jameson or Jack Daniels that I would drink. And I did that for many years, mixing cocktails, or not really cocktails, but more of a highball, I guess, whiskey and soda. And then 2018, I started to say there's got to be something different out here. There's hundreds of whiskeys on the shelf. They can't all be the same. So started dabbling in, and I started with Irish. Irish whiskey was good. And finally there was a point in time where I purchased every bottle of Irish whiskey available in my town. So then I moved on to bourbon, and bourbon was fun for a little bit, but I started quickly noticing that there was a very similar vein throughout all of them. So then I moved on to single malt, Scottish single malt specifically, and the rest is history from there. Single malt it grabbed my attention and held on and has not let go yet, and I don't foresee it happening anytime soon. But as far as getting into American single malts for me, I thought it was really cool as a category, up and coming category, to see, like, we have this opportunity to shape this category, so to speak, right? Nobody alive right now drinking whiskey was around when bourbon was defined, right? So we are in a state right now, in a time that we can help define this category. And this category is like the biggest category across the world. Everybody makes single malt throughout the world. And now we do. And I think we really need to protect that and get it solidified. And this is what it is. So this is an important conversation. I think it needs to be had.
Yeah. And that was very well put, right? The now we do too. And recently, very important thing to note, that this is a world tradition that's super old. And because of the rules in the United States that sort of emphasize bourbon and a couple of other styles that you're more familiar with, some craft distillers who were like, we really want to make single malt, just said, we're going to do that. And then once there were enough of them, they said, we should make this a thing. We should make the government make this a thing, right? Get some protections. So yeah, definitely. And I guess because we have audience from Germ and Jake here, maybe Phil and I should also introduce ourselves a little bit. I'll try to be more brief because I do plenty of talking on this show. Anyway, you can watch the backlog and learn all about me. Actually, you should go watch the interview that John Hughes of Embellish Pod had me on his show. where I talked about myself for 2 hours, basically. So if you really want to hear me talk about myself, that's the place to go. I try to be cognizant of the fact that this show is not about me, it's about my guests, but even so. So I started drinking whiskey, basically, Wild Turkey 81 was the first whiskey that I liked that I thought didn't taste like poison. I had it on the rocks with Dad, so that it has that special place in my heart. And for years after that, I just alternated between Wild Turkey and Maker's Mark. So I started with bourbon, but I kind of never felt the desire to explore until I went to Japan and discovered single malt there, actually. So my first single malt was Yamazaki 12, back when it was $60 a bottle in 2015. So that was kind of fun. And at the time, I was under the mistaken impression that Scotch was either bad or expensive. And so I thought that Japanese whiskey was the way to get budget access to single malts. I was sorely mistaken. And once I figured that out, I started tasting Scotch. And I met some people who were into Scotch. I joined the Whiskey Lodge community that we rep all the time on this show. There's a link in the description. Got introduced to other sorts of styles. Basically met Joseph O'Sullivan, maker at the time, the maker of McCarthy's single malt. Thank you, Phil, who's showing a bottle on screen. And like, he was just a cool guy. He like drinks whiskey with us, whatever. Every once in a while, he would show up drinking McCarthy's, and we're like, "Hey, are you drinking McCarthy's because like it's your own product, or because you think it's really good compared to, say, you know, XYZ, whatever?" And he's like, "Actually, I really think it's good." And I'm like, "Okay, because you're such a genuine person," and like he really came off that way, right? I'm gonna go give this a try, right? I'm not gonna take that as marketing. I'm gonna take that as a genuine recommendation from a friend. Went and tried it, fell in love with it. This was the very first bottle here of American single malt I ever bought. And it is to date one of my favorites. Actually, almost 2 years after I bought this, I found another bottle of this exact same single barrel still sitting dusty on the shelf in that Total Wine. And I bought it because I needed to replenish my first favorite American single malt. And through Joseph, I got connected with a lot of people in the American single malt segment of the industry gradually. And I somehow got this idea I should write a book about American single malt. As long as I'm writing a book about American single malt, I need to do some primary research. I should do some interviews. As long as I'm doing interviews, I should publish them somewhere. Hence, now we have a podcast. So that's why this exists. And the mission of this whole thing is spreading the word about American single malt and all the varieties that are available to as many people as possible in whatever media form you like. So on Discord, you can chat with me. I'll share what I'm drinking now. On Instagram, it tends to be, you know, shorter content and reviews. And here we talk for hours ad nauseum about the topic of the week. So whatever format of content works for you, we aim to provide. We hope you enjoy. Phil, go ahead and tell us a bit about yourself.
My introduction to whiskey happened on the definitely the night after, and definitely not the night before my 21st birthday. My older sibling introduced me to what would become the first whiskey love of my life, which is rye whiskey, specifically from Catoctin Creek. And I went from, you know, an interest in, you know, well, what's affordable and near me, to I saw Ardbeg 10 on sale, and I figured I've never had Scotch before. I'll buy that. And learned the expensive lesson of I really like heavily peated whiskey. And that sort of became my focus for a while. And over the past several years, I've had a couple of different YouTube channels where a friend and I made videos about cocktails and how to make them, and interesting cocktail science. That sort of fell by the wayside. And then I want to say sometime in 2017 or 2018, I purchased probably one of the last bottles of Wasman's single malt with this particular label that was on shelves in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that was my introduction to American single malt whiskey. It, you know, sort of my appreciation of whiskey sort of became almost an obsession. I don't want to say it was, but I was the person that all of my friends came to when they had questions about whiskey or what to get, and that became written reviews, which became review videos on my personal YouTube channel, and I found the Whiskey Lodge, I think, in 2019, and from there made friends with Doug and a bunch of the folks there, including Joseph O'Sullivan, and sort of really discovered American single malt as a broader category through Joe, because my understanding of American single malt was that it was Copper Fox, Virginia Distillery Company, and the only bottle of single malt whiskey outside of Virginian single malt at that point that I ever purchased was a bottle of Stranahan's original, the yellow label with the tin on the top. And Stranahan's is great, but it didn't really grab me. And the Copper Fox is a totally different beast from, like, say, the Virginia Distillery Company's products. And then there was McCarthy's, which, can go toe to toe with the heavy hitters on Isla, and in some cases, very much come out on top. And I'm not really sure where I ended up on, or how I ended up on the single malt frontier. Just sort of happened fast, but here I am.
Yeah, McCarthy's definitely can definitely can hold its own against its Scottish relatives. I compare it to Lagavulin 16 quite often. And now that Lagavulin 8 is more of a thing, I definitely compare some of that 6-year stuff to that Lagavulin 8. And I'm happy to have the McCarthy's available. Tater Dom.
Now, sadly, though, I'm over here in Kentucky where I have a wonderland of bourbon and rye, but yet almost no American single malt. So it is frustrating that to know that all these quality options exist for American single malt, yet pretty much the only brand of American single malt that is reliably available in Kentucky is Stranahan's. And it's just, I would love to see that change. Even, McCarthy's. That's not sold anywhere near me, and it's very disappointing.
Thanks, Joe.
Well, we'll have to ask them how to find you a bottle, because they like doing that. They love it when people reach out and ask, where can I get it? And sometimes they'll even make sure that it gets to you, right? They'll make sure they're in your state, because they're in most of the states. I mean, the majority of the states for sure, and a few countries as well. I forget exactly what the count is.
So we
I'm not going to
unfortunately
spend all day. Sorry, you don't have it in
we don't have them
Michigan, right?
Wisconsin, but
Wisconsin.
I'm able to order online and get shipped in, so that's at least beneficial.
Yep.
One of the major hurdles is that there are basically networks of distributors, and they don't like to step on each other's toes. And so if there's a distributor that already carries McCarthy's in your state, other distributors are less likely to want to take it up because they don't want to step on their competitors' toes too much.
Right.
But if that distributor doesn't cover your part of the state, you're just kind of out of luck.
Right. Yeah, and we do have that here in the state, but we only have, realistically, we have 3 big distributors and then like a few small ones. And they totally are locked in on their specific brands. So, but
should we go ahead and
that's what I was going to say.
define single malt whiskey as the rest of the world understands it?
Yes, let's do that. absolutely.
Because in most of the world, the whiskey that you're looking for is the single malt whiskey. Because in the rest of the world, single malt whiskey, and there are various minor detail differences here and there, but by and large, in the rest of the world, single malt whiskey is the standard. It is 100% malted barley from a single distillery. And those are the two most important elements of that descriptor.
Mhm.
And in the States, the most similar already existing standard is American malt whiskey, which is much like the other varieties of American whiskey, such as rye or bourbon. It is defined as a mash bill of a minimum of 51% malted barley, which is not comparable to what the rest of the world sees as malt or single malt whiskey.
Yeah, and there's a broader definition of whiskey in the world is a product fermented from grain and distilled and aged in a wooden container, usually oak, but Australia notably just says oak, just says wood container, and a few other countries as well. So there is not a universal agreement that there needs to be a minimum age either, just that it has been in oak. And in the United States, we're a lot more lax on that. If it has been in oak for any length of time, that generally counts as whiskey. And it's important to note that as we get into here, because a lot of people assume the normative definition of single malt is what Scotland uses, which is a minimum of 3 years in oak, right?
Right.
Any type of cask. That's another interesting thing. We're kind of getting into the woods on the definition, which I'll put up in a second. But before we do that, I want to ask you guys all, when you first saw American single malt on a product, what were your expectations of what that would be?
I'll go first. So coming from a bourbon-centric background, I kind of looked at it as the rest of the world had the monopoly on quality single malt whiskey. Seeing these extended aging statements on Scotch and whatnot, because the single malt industry in Scotland has been around for far longer. So you're competing with 12 and 20-year age statements in Europe, and at that point, American single malt, nowhere close to that. And I was really expecting to be let down because, how on earth could a 16-month or a 2-year American single malt be good if the standard for good single malt is the Macallan 12, or something with that kind of age statement. But then I was pleasantly surprised when I started getting into it. And of course, American single malt can go with, new charred oak or, a little more liberty there. Even with younger age statements, it's really good. And it doesn't have to compete with single malt from the rest of the world. American single malt, even with younger age statements, is very good. But that was not what I was expecting when I first started going in that direction. But they proved me wrong.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for me, my expectation was, since I was into Scottish single malt very heavily, my expectation was I wanted it to be similar. And I was surprised sometimes. I was happy sometimes because some are very similar to some kind of Scottish whiskey. Yes, with a younger age on it, but still very similar type of profile. I quickly shifted gears in my expectation and said, this is not a replacement product. This is not intended to replace Scottish whiskey or anything like that. This is its own thing, to stand on its own 2 feet, to do its own thing, and be a quality single malt from just a different part of the world than what we are used to. And I'm happy with that expectation in it. And since I've kind of fallen into that expectation, I have been pleasantly surprised every time.
Want to add to that, you saying that American single malt is not meant to be a replacement product. I like the fact that American single malt tries in many ways to be unique. I'll say a whiskey that I tried earlier tonight before this. There's a new independent bottler in America, much like Lost Lantern and Two Souls, called American Single Cask. They're just now hitting the market. You can buy from their website. They're also featured on Sealbox. But one of the distilleries that they featured that I had tonight was Santa Fe Spirits. Under Santa Fe, they go by Kilkeegan. But it was a 6+ year single cask strength mesquite smoked single malt. Of the 100% malted barley, 30% of that barley is smoked mesquite wood. It is ridiculously good. It is crazy good. It's a American wood smoked malted barley that is fantastic in its own right, and it has nothing to do with Scotch whiskey. We want to compare, or some want to compare, how does American single malt compare or stack up against Scotch single malt? Forget that. This American single cask, 6-year cask strength, mesquite smoked barley from Santa Fe Spirits, in its own right, no comparison, is amazing. And it's unique.
All right.
So we have a nice comment from Rye M Legend. It's mostly a Scotch drinker, inferior and youthful.
Sorry, multiple comments went by there. Yeah, as a mostly Scotch drinker, inferior and youthful. Yeah,
and I love this. I love the reason I like this comment is because I love this obstacle that American single malt has to overcome, and I think for me, I think they do a great job overcoming that. Yes, there is still going to be some youthful products out there, but for the most part, even some of the 1-year products that I've had are very, very promising.
Yeah, some of them maybe are even better for it,
but they have some serious promise.
Yeah, I think I like highlighting this comment. So first of all, Ryan Legend or Ryan is one of the other reviewers on maltrunners.com, which is a review collective I'm part of. And I do know his style preference, that he doesn't particularly like the youthful nature of American single malt whiskey. I think this is a great comment to highlight here because most of the time on this show, we talk in flying colors about American single malt whiskey, can do no wrong. There's some selection bias there, right? A lot of the guests we intentionally pick are whiskeys we already know we like, because we want to be able to talk favorably without bias in terms of like, oh, they gave us a sample, so we're going to say nice things about them, right? Most of the time, we prefer to start with like, we have nice things to say about the whiskey before we have the guest on, so we don't have to be sitting there confronting someone with like, oh, you sent us this free sample, we don't actually like it very much, or lying, right? Which we don't want to do. We want to be honest and sort of give you the truth for us, right? Our subjective truth about the category. Whiskey tastes vary. Not everybody watching this show is going to agree with us, right?
Right.
And Brian, I would say, is a good friend. We happen to disagree on this point. I'm totally okay with that. And he has some older Westlands that he is a fan of. So we have turned him on to a couple of American single malts at the very least. But yeah, by and large, the pack of American single malts is quite young, 3 years and younger for the most part, a lot of them. And that's a hurdle for people who are really interested, who are used to higher age statements and a particular flavor profile. You can taste youthfulness in a whiskey. A lot of whiskeys for me that taste youthful can be better for it, right? Like a really punchy Isla that is on the younger side. One of my favorite scotches is like a 5-year-old Isla from an independent bottler. And I think my favorite standards to go to are Ardbeg 10, Laphroaig 10, right? Things that are on the younger end of scotch as well. Climate plays a role, etc. That's part of the conversation, right? I think we should be having that conversation, that American single malt will benefit from getting older, I think. And they have an advantage in that respect because unlike most American whiskey, they're not required, according to the proposed standard, which we're kind of here to talk about today, they're not required to age in new oak casks. That gives them a lot of extra time. The thing holding them back right now is that many of these American single malt producers are less than 2 decades old. They haven't had the time to age whiskey up where they can consistently put out a 12-year-old. And the ones that do are quite expensive.
Oh yeah.
No
A
kidding.
great example of the youthfulness in this segment is I am holding in my hand a bottle of whiskey from a distillery founded in 2020. This bottle was bottled in 2022. This is a 2-year-old American single malt whiskey, and it definitely shows its youthfulness. And it is far from my favorite American single malt whiskey. But there are elements of quality there that just need a little bit longer. And if you don't give them enough support to get older, they won't be able to make any more whiskey. And
Right. This is the
you know,
usual support your local small business sort
Yeah.
of thing, which is a big part of right now. This phase that we're in with American single malt is look for the promise so you can support the brands that have promise so they can last long enough to give you the older, more mature stuff that you're looking for.
And I feel like when it comes to the bourbon industry, we're on the other side of that now. You know, it was only a couple of years ago when the craft bourbon meant 18-month bourbon that was $60 a bottle, and it was not particularly good. But now we're at a point where all these craft bourbon distilleries, they're starting to crank out 5, 6, and 7-year-old bourbon, and it's glorious. But we went through a rough period of promise but not quality to get there. So, you know, we're going to go through that same period where we had years of 18-month-old American single malt before we get to this 4, 6, and 7 year. And it's going to be a lot of fun when we get there. But yeah, we have to support them and recognize the promise until the distillery themselves are old enough.
And a lot of that comes down to just the breadth of barrels, because when you're starting out and you have to get a product out, unless you are, you know, taking half of your distillate to make gin or vodka to just make money to keep the lights on, you are facing the struggle of not having a whole lot in terms of volume of barrels to draw from when you're bottling your product. And the longer you are distilling and the more you have to put away, the larger your selection to blend from down the road becomes.
Gonna highlight a couple of comments. Sorry, go ahead if you're.
I was about to respond to one, but go ahead.
Yeah. So we have, first of all, some positive. Fan of Westward. I also really like Westward. I think it is the most bottles I have by any single distillery, which kind of happened by accident, but I'm in the club, and being in the club means that every quarter I get a new one. So that happened. But I also, it's my go-to comfort whiskey, especially the Pinot cask. Rough Spirit says it's still not good half the time. I would like to spin that positively and say, let's focus on the half that is good, because that's a great ratio.
And I think that comment was geared towards the craft bourbon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well,
but
and
I'm not 100% certain on that, but I think that's where it was. That's about the time it came in.
Okay.
I would also argue, and perhaps I'm being in the unique position of being in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where we have so many fantastic craft distilleries. I have encountered 3 distilleries from whom I would not buy again, out of the roughly 40 that I have tried expressions from in the Commonwealth of Virginia alone.
Right. And Phil has basically an encyclopedic knowledge of Virginia whiskey because he runs the Virginia whiskey tournament every year. So he's keeping tabs on who is actively releasing whiskey or who's even producing it. Some you can't even get the whiskey yet.
Yeah, there are a couple that basically you have to go to the distillery to get.
Can't trust a rum guy. Yeah, that's right. That comment was about Marshall. Rough Spirits is focused mainly on rum.
But I mean,
I'm still going to try to get him on to co-host Texas Whiskey, though. So
it's
Ooh.
just a matter of being able to find the gems within even less enjoyable spirits. You know, because like I said, if you don't support them, they aren't going to be there. If you don't support your single malt distillers now, in 10 years, when you know the bulk of the distilleries would be, you know, ranging in age from, you know, 15 to or 12 to 15 years old, if you don't support them now, they aren't going to be there then. And then you're really going to be sitting there wondering why there's a lack of good American single malt whiskey.
yeah,
Because
you know what I would like to see in terms of age? I would like to see competition in that 12-year-old age bracket, because right now the 2 or 3 producers that are releasing are super expensive. Thinking of Triple Eight, for example. It would be really cool to see McCarthy's get to 12 years old and see what kind of price point
They're
can get.
there. They're just not releasing it, or they're blending it down, or whatever the case may be. But they have.
Right.
I can't believe that they don't have stocks in the upper teens.
Oh, I would
think we
believe
could.
it.
I think we could nearly confirm that unofficially, because they've talked multiple times in the past, years and years ago, about how they let the whiskey get to 6 years and they keep it on the rocket ship going up in age just to see what happens. The question is it going to be single cask? Is it going to be enough to release a standard release, right? It takes more, like, you start distilling and you let 1% of your whiskey get to a certain age, 12 years old, say. You can't start releasing a core release with that. My read between the lines was they've started consistently releasing 6-year whiskey, which means they have a significant quantity of whiskey older than that as well.
Yes.
And it's just a matter of time before we see 8, 9, 10, possibly.
But you know, and my stand
I would also,
on these for sure is
we
they've been around.
we know that they're occasionally letting apple brandy get that old.
Right. Yeah. So we do know, and that's not even their oldest cask, right? We know that for sure. That they had multiple single barrels of 15-year-old apple brandy at Clear Creek, which is absolutely delicious, by the way. And you can still get it in Hood River and Portland, if I'm not mistaken. So if you needed an excuse, Patricia, if you need an excuse to go visit Westward, you should also visit the Hood River tasting room and get a bottle of that 15-year-old brandy. Can recommend that. Absolutely.
I think as we're all patiently waiting for 10 and 12-year American single malt, just so that it has similar age statements to Scotch, I think some people, though, still get caught up in that snobbery of, as we're waiting, 3-year can't be that great. You know, I think I told Doug recently that I've come to the conclusion that from top to bottom, my personal favorite American single malt whiskey distillery is Copperworks in Seattle. I've done a couple of reviews now for Drink Hacker. Most of the ones that I've reviewed have been in the 3-year age range. You know, Copperworks here, they're bottling a lot of stuff in that 3-year age range, and it's crazy good. And I've also found that of the stuff that Copperworks puts out that I like the most, it's the 3-year in the used cask. So yes, we're all looking forward to that 10 and 12-year stuff, and we're looking for promise, but there's a lot of really good stuff in the American single malt market right now that's like 3 years old.
Phil is for anyone who's listening only, Phil has been teasing this bottle of Whiskey Del Bach for the last 2 minutes.
Under a year old, 11 months old. An amazing American single malt whiskey.
Yeah.
I had no idea that it was less than a year old, right? When I had first tasted Del Bach, I was like, it's got to be 3 years old, right? I didn't expect it to be old. It's the high desert, right? 2 years old, 3 years old, something like that. When Lost Lantern put an age statement in months on that bottle, I was like, what the hell? It tastes way more mature than that.
Yeah, they do a good job with that. But you know, as we're sitting here, you know, and Jake, you brought it up, as we're sitting here waiting for age statements to come along, there is so much good stuff in between new make and 12 years old. I mean, I have so many in the 4, 5, 6 year range that are absolutely fantastic and fantastic to the point where I don't think they need to change anything. They don't need to make it different. They don't need to make it older. It's good as is.
Yeah.
And obviously with barrel differences, new barrel versus used barrel versus some kind of finish, all of that stuff changes slightly where they are in the country. And we're a vast country with lots of different micro, climates. So things can rapidly change from, let's say, Iowa to Montana. That's two totally different climates, and realistically, they're not that far apart.
Yep. We'd like to talk about maturity rather than age, right? That came up last week as well when we were talking about Copper Fox, which I don't know if you've teased that since we went live, Phil. The Wasmans.
I haven't really. I should talk about it a little bit more. It's 25 months old, so just over 2 years old. It's this beautiful color, and it actually falls into one of the edge cases on will it be considered American single malt whiskey after rules ratification, which I think we should talk more about after we take a look at the TTB proposal.
Yeah,
because
thanks for bringing us back around to that.
Yeah, because I think that's
we need to move on with our agenda because we're 45 minutes in. So I'll just make a comment about how y'all answered this question about expectations on American single malt. I was sort of intending that question to go in the direction of like what you would think it means, which is almost such a pedestrian answer. I guess for this group of people that you all answered in terms of quality, what you were expecting about American single malt. And I largely agree. I think the first time I heard American single malt, and I'm looking at this thing from Texas, Balcones, that's 3 years old and going like, that can't be as good as a 12-year Scotch, right? And, back in 2021, when I was still a bit of an age snob, as we all sort of start out, right? Like age is good. That's like the first thing they tell you when you get into whiskey, right? Age is good. More age is better, right? Until you get to a certain point and then it's too expensive or it actually gets worse. And that's sort of the second thing you learn is sometimes too old is too old, right? But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised right after the McCarthy's, which is 3 years old. And I kept for a while, I was like, oh, but it's got to be like almost 4, and almost 4 matters, right? It's higher. And I just don't care anymore, right? This is age stated 3-year-old whiskey. And it doesn't matter the fact that it was like a month short or 4 months short of 4 years old because it's just delicious, right? This is mature whiskey. I don't even know what the age statement is on the American vatted malt. This was the second American single malt I ever tried, which is actually not even technically an American single malt. We'll get into that. This is a blended malt by the Scotch Reckoning, which would not fit into the definition of American single malt, but nonetheless is a product comprised of American single malts, and that makes it interesting to me. I believe the age statement on this one is like less than 2 years, though, because it's got Santa Fe in it, among other things, but they've got the age statement somewhere. Not sure. It's not written on the bottle. And the third one that I tried was a single barrel from Balcones, right? Which is dense and oaky and less than 4 years old. I was just, every single one of these blew me away, made me want to explore the category more. And they're also different from each other. Those ones that I just mentioned, McCarthy's, the vatted malt, which comprises a lot of stuff, the Balcones, Copperworks as well. I think I tried around the same time. Like in some ways, all of those whiskeys could not be more different from each other. And they still have this thing in common. That is that they are American single malt whiskey. I like complexity. I like diversity in my food and drink experiences. I'm always looking for the next new thing. And American single malt feels like an inexhaustible category. But I definitely was raising an eyebrow at like, they're not old enough yet, right? I was super intrigued by, oh, I love single malt. It's cool that they're making it in my home country now, right? That was my initial thought. But I was like, they're not old enough yet. I want them to be older. And I've changed my mind almost entirely. Some whiskeys are not mature enough yet, but that's on a brand by brand basis. And it's not age that makes them mature. So
absolutely.
In terms of what I expected the definition to be, 100% barley. That was my only expectation because that was my simplistic understanding of what single malt is. And I think that's probably true for most consumers. But I have also met a bunch of consumers who have completely different ideas about what American single malt is when they're not looking at a definition, right? They say single malt. What about malted rye? Why does single malt have to be malted barley is like the first question that I got, and the first question I couldn't answer.
So this was a question that I actually did want to bring up on the show here is a single malt whiskey, does that definitely have to mean only 100% malted barley? Can it be 100% malted rye? Can it be 100% malted wheat? Can it be malted corn? It is delicious. But does it have to? I mean, the word malt is in there, and it doesn't and I know that the proposal is 100% malted barley, but can we have 100% malted grain? It has to be that grain, 100% of it malted, and could be called a single malt. And I think yes. I mean, I'm in camp yes. Rye, wheat, barley, corn, oats. If you can malt oats, I don't know if you can. But yes, I'm in camp yes, as far as because it's exploration. It's a different, it's something cool, right?
I'm gonna go find the press release because they actually did specifically call out malted rye, if I'm not mistaken.
And they should, because that's the most common, other than barley.
I mean, and there are malted rye whiskeys from Canada that are 100% malted rye. And my understanding is that malting rye before fermentation and distillation makes it slightly easier to distill or ferment because rye is notoriously hard to ferment. But I don't know that for sure. I would have to talk to somebody who has distilled lots of rye to do that.
My understanding is that malting it doesn't gum up quite as well or quite as much as unmalted rye. But in addition, malting the rye changes the character quite a bit. So,
a lot.
Whether or not we're allowed to call malted rye a single malt, I do hope that we get more of a market. But I feel like if we're trying to give credibility to the American single malt barley whiskey, I think is confusing to a lot of people when they have this notion that single malt definitely means barley, and then we're tossing in a few outliers like Old Potrero or whatnot, claiming single malt. Well, hey, wait a second, what's up here?
Yeah, so I want to respond to this comment really quickly. It is on topic. So Cedar Ridge makes a malted wheat that's technically a single malt. Is not entirely a true statement. It is they do make a 100% malted wheat whiskey, which does not meet the current proposed definition of American single malt, which in that definition, malt means malted barley, and that's true in the rest of American regulations as well. And I couldn't find the source. I apologize. That's what I was typing for a moment there. I should have muted my mic. Sorry. The commission does not disagree with the idea that there could be a single malted rye category or something along those lines. But that's not actually what we're currently talking about. But it's important to note that the rules proposal does not exclude that from existing. And they're actually in favor of it because American consumers think of malted grains differently from the rest of the world. And they also think of this phrase single malt as meaning a single type of grain, 100% malted, and a whiskey from that. And that's a reasonable interpretation of the phrase. The sort of difficult thing in terms of the education of, like, I guess the typical American consumer about what does single malt in America mean is, well, we took the definition of Scotch single malt, where the single and the malt mean two different things, actually. Single means a single distillery. Malt means 100% malted barley made on a pot still. The American definition said, forget about the still type, forget about the cask type, forget about the age. But we never really had this concept of a single distillery because that's the default in the United States. Blended whiskeys from multiple distilleries is actually the rarity here, right? everybody's operating on a single distillery scale for the most part. And it's more that they want to protect that. And they're just saying, okay, that phrase single malt in Scotland means this collection of things, and the etymology is not important. But we're going to make the phrase single malt in the United States mean that more or less, but within the structure of the existing TTB rules for distillation proof, barreling proof, blah, blah, all this other technical stuff that doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, the consumer should expect single malt is 100% barley. And the asterisk from a single distillery is almost redundant with American whiskey, but not entirely. It's important to have it there, right? So now that we've really gotten into the weeds on this definition, let's actually look at it on screen.
I was going to say this is probably a good time to look at what the proposed definitions actually are.
Right. So to be clear, this definition comes from the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission, right? What they have proposed, this is the 200 plus or 100 plus members out of the 250-ish producers of American single malt in the United States that have joined in with the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. And what that says is we all commit to making whiskey in this way. Here is what we propose. American single malt whiskey should be made from 100% malted barley, should be distilled entirely at one distillery, should be mashed, distilled, and matured in the United States of America. Does not say anything about malting, by the way, which is kind of an interesting point. Matured in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 liters. There's a couple of interesting parts in that. We'll come back to it. Distilled to no more than 160 proof and bottled at 80 proof. Those are common with every other style of American whiskey, right?
Yeah.
So ignoring those last two bullet points, which are standard language for whiskey categories. Going to the top, made from 100% malted barley, that's what the world expects of the phrase single malt. Distilled entirely at one distillery, same thing. Mash, distilled, and matured in the United States of America is one of those things where you're like, oh, duh. But it's not a given, right? Your mash, your wort could technically come from across the border in Canada if you wanted. I think there's some American distilleries who are actually doing that. If I'm not mistaken... Well, okay, yes, there's that, but Phil, VHW from Virginia Distilling Company doesn't qualify as American single malt.
No. Oh, no. It never would have, but
right.
It's
but
part of part of the reason for the distilled and matured part of that statement.
Right. This
but
rule
that also
makes it,
means that McCarthy's is safe because they buy their malt from Scotland.
Already malted and smoked in Scotland. Right. So they're allowed to do that because
they're still mashing it and distilling it here, but it is pre-malted somewhere else.
Right. Mm-hmm. So it's what they didn't say in these rules that's actually really interesting. There's only one thing here where they said something they didn't need to say. And some people are like, that's weird. Why did they say that? That's stupid. And that's that oak casks not exceeding 700 liters. Nobody uses casks that size. When they're full, you can't move them. Right. I asked at Balcones the reason why, because they're in such a hot, aggressive climate. If anyone was going to use barrels that size, it would be someone who's concerned about aging too fast. They said, no, 53 gallon oak is standard. We're using 57 gallons and that's plenty, right? They don't even go anywhere. And that's like 200 liters, 230 liters, something like that. It's not even close to 700 liters. 700 liters is like a ton is technically bigger than 700 liters, but a butt is smaller. And that's like your typical size for sherry. Those huge casks that you'll see when you
like
go visit
500
a distillery.
liters.
500 liters, yeah.
Yeah.
So why this? So why this restriction?
It's a viable aging cask for American single malt with this definition. And, that is a way that you are going to get a larger age statement. Because it is such a large vessel and it's going to be used. So that is a way. And I'm happy they put that 700 liter, max on there because that gives us the option to do so.
Right. So Ryan says it differently, but also perhaps better, or it's just worth restating. At Westward, they say malt has colloquially meant malted barley for pretty much forever. Right. That's just the world expects that malt means malted barley unless you say some other type of malted grain in the context of whiskey. So instead of just saying malted barley all the time, because that was the default whiskey in most of the world, Scotland, Ireland, whatever, they just shortened it to malt.
Well,
Because the distinction they need to make. I'm sorry, was I interrupting someone?
Good.
Okay. Why this 700 liters thing here? It's interesting because no other category of whiskey has that restriction in the United States. They basically don't say anything about cask size. Some
But
people
that
say
comes from Scotland, I think.
Right.
If you look at
it comes
Scottish
from the
rules.
Scotch rules.
Yeah.
It comes from the Scotch rules. So this is meant as a nod to Scotch whiskey, and what it does is ensure that anything that is produced in the United States labeled single malt can be sold in Scotland and everywhere else that basically takes Scotland as the rules, as long as it's at least 3 years old, because that's the only additional requirement.
So along that line, I assume that that's also part of why it's important. You know, we define American single malt as barley, so that, you know, we can be sold everywhere on the world stage.
Yes. Oh, sorry, I misspoke. There's 2 additional requirements that make it Scotch single malt. You have to use a pot still in Scotch single malt, and it has to be aged for 3 years. Besides that, American single malt is entirely compatible with Scotch. And the ways in which it's not entirely compatible with Scotch are basically because it's meant to be compatible with the rest of the language in the standards of identity for American whiskey. So that's a lot of the why behind this. What's actually really interesting. Okay, let me go see if I can find this real quick when I stop talking. In the proposal, the TTB proposal, the actual language that gets added to the standards of identity is 1 sentence and 1 row in a table. These 6 rules boiled down to being almost the same as everything else, to the point they needed 2 items added to the standards of identity. And let me just highlight, the purpose of this conversation is, why hasn't TTB ratified this thing yet?
Right.
And we're quibbling over a sentence and a line in a table, right?
Yeah.
Which expands to these rules, yes, but it just highlights how utterly simple what we're asking for is.
Which leads me to believe that somebody somewhere that is maybe a little bit more important is helping stop it. You know, not to throw out conspiracy theories or anything like that, but it's not that difficult. Like what we're asking for and what this is being asked for is not that difficult. It shouldn't take 2 years to do this. So what is the actual holdup?
And it's important to note that the public reaction to this was a general thumbs up.
The overwhelming
There were 2 comments that I recall, 2 out of the hundreds that I read, that were not in favor of adoption of these standards. And they were specifically from producers who would be exceeded or excluded from these standards because they distilled to a higher proof, or because they took exception specifically to one of the proposed changes. And with the rest of the distilling community and the enthusiast community being so overwhelmingly in favor of this, it is strange that it has not been adopted.
Very.
Yeah. So I pulled up here. This is the TTB proposal that boils down those rules. It is compatible with what the commission was asking for. This is all that it is. Add a sentence at the end of paragraph B, which reads, American single malt must be distilled entirely at one U.S. distillery, mash distilled and aged in the United States. And add, they say paragraph, but that's more legalese, right? This is line 15 in a table. This is about distillation and storage proofs and barrel size, right? And also no neutral spirits permitted. This last point in this, so the rules we just looked at, pretty understandable. When this proposal came out, most of the backlash I saw in the community was about this very last point, which I'm going to highlight over here. Allowable coloring, flavoring, and blending materials permitted. They said, yes, I want to once again defend that this makes sense.
Yeah.
that they did it this way. This proposal for American single malt whiskey is not a proposal for straight American single malt whiskey. Straight would be the distinction that normally disallows coloring, flavoring, and blending materials, and additionally sets a minimum age of 2 years. The fact that they put this here in this table is more that was the default for a non-straight designation.
And I saw this, and I have a problem with this. I do. I think
I do too.
We have
Absolutely
this
still have a
golden
problem with it.
opportunity to be better than Scottish counterparts that do allow coloring, do allow chill filtration, all of that. I think we have this opportunity to be better than that and be proud of the whiskey that's made without altering it in any way.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the way that it should be done. You know, if we get the standard of identity every way we want and it adds the color and filtration possibility to it, am I going to be upset about it? No, we got basically what we were looking for. And the people that are making good quality single malt are still going to be making good quality, unchill filtered, uncolored single malt.
But I do think
you're just going to have a flood of few.
But yeah, I mean, I think the American consumer, I feel like a lot of us, we look at all American whiskey like it should have similar standard quality as bourbon. So, you know, we understand bourbon is an America's native spirit. You can't add any coloring. I don't know. I feel like that's probably a pretty important aspect to a lot of American whiskey drinkers, that our whiskey isn't adulterated with color.
Right.
I like that idea.
I do. I like that as well. And yes, a lot of it isn't. You know, and I use filtration in there as well. You know, and Jack Daniel's always filtrates, you know, charcoal, whatever the case may be, and many other Tennessee whiskeys as well. But that's a thing for their standard of identity. You know,
Yep.
Nobody else is really doing so.
Yep.
So I would like to.
Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'd like to address a couple of comments real quick. The first one is this. In the context of our conversation, when we are referring to Scotch, we are referring to single malt Scotch, which is by necessity and by Scottish law distilled in a copper pot still. Single grain can be distilled in a column still, but that's not the parity that we are looking at.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for defending me. I was going to defend myself. I appreciate I wasn't the one who had to do it, because that means that I'm not just blowing smoke. But yeah, that's exactly what happened there. I spoke quickly. I probably misspoke. In the interest of completeness, I'll put it this way: in order to be Scotch single malt, in order to be Scotch whiskey, it has to be 3 years old. In order to be Scotch single malt, it has to be 100% barley at a single distillery in a pot still. Single grain is any other distillate from a single distillery, and blends are from multiple distilleries. So that's for completeness, but you've heard that a million times. We're looking at the difference between Scotch single malt and American single malt in the context of that conversation. And thank you for that point. If anyone else was confused about that, I'm glad that you clarified that, because I wouldn't want to be spreading misinformation unintentionally.
The next two comments are actually from Instagram. They're from Serial Distiller, whose comments, unfortunately, I can't highlight on the screen because I can't do that for Instagram comments. The use of new oak as a standard of identity for almost all American whiskeys is interesting, and I've heard that larger distillers would prefer that the malt whiskey definition be used, or include a necessity for new oak. I'm assuming for that second comment that you mean in the single malt definition. And interestingly, I have two examples of single malts from what would be considered larger traditional producers in Kentucky, one of which is Claremont Steep, which is aged in new charred oak barrels, and the Yellowstone single malt, which is also aged in new charred oak barrels. And that's interesting, and that is potentially true. I know that frequently larger distilleries try to hedge their bets to sort of maintain a position of power over smaller distilleries in a variety of ways. I am not sure that that is really the case with this one. It makes sense for Beam to use new charred oak barrels because they already primarily use new charred oak barrels, and it is entirely possible that they would rather use new charred oak barrels for their Claremont Steep rather than used bourbon barrels because of a particular flavor profile that they are aiming for. I could be wrong, but I'd rather give them the benefit of the doubt of they're looking for a specific flavor profile rather than them trying to push for a designation that would be more favorable to them, even though they have a history of doing that.
Yep.
So I think
By
it
the way,
makes sense
Serial
for-
Distiller
I
is
was
Tyler
gonna ask, do you
Peterson.
know who Serial Distiller
Yeah.
is?
Yeah, Serial Distiller is Tyler Peterson, who's the master distiller at Westland. So you should go follow his account. He's awesome. He actually posted some great videos, not reels, but videos in his story earlier today. Unless I'm mixing that up.
We also
It
look
might have been the
though-
Westland account. Never mind.
or when the whole standard of new oak became prominent, that was a point when cooperages in America, when America was getting away from using barrels to store everything. There was a time in American history when everything that got shipped was shipped in barrels, not just whiskey, everything. And then we started transitioning toward other shipping containers, and the American cooperage industry was losing their minds because outside of whiskey, they were becoming they became obsolete as a shipping container. So they lobbied to Congress to say, hey, can we at least have this to save us as an industry? Can we at least say that all American bourbon has to be aged in new containers to prop that up? So, when that standard of identity was set, there was a very specific reason for it in American culture. That's not what's happening now. So
the crazy part about that, Jake, is
okay,
not a lot of people know
they're
that.
treated differently.
And I think that's great that you said that, because not a lot of people do know that. That's, I mean, there's a common misconception that it was the wood industry, the timber industry that says you got to do this because we got to keep cutting down trees and selling our stuff. It's not the case. There was businesses that were threatened to go out of business because we all of a sudden started changing what we did.
So there's precedent. There's precedent for this, right? Australia and a couple of other countries just say wood.
Ireland,
right? Yep. Yeah, they actually. So I just came back from Ireland. We'll talk about that some other time. But one of the tours I went on, he was like, "And we have no rules about cask type. Any type of cask you want. So we get all this cool stuff." And I'm like, "Yeah, but everything you just talked about was oak. So you didn't really make your point." Yeah, walnut aged single malt, cool, right? You can age on chips, or you can age in other barrels for secondary aging here in the United States. So like you at least have that. But the cool thing about that, like, aged in a barrel, actually in American rules could be reduced in a different way to touched oak for any period of time, as long as it was new, which means that we're really just wasting
Pabst
oak
Blue Ribbon
as early as possible. Yeah.
Well,
The ones that say aged for a minute in.
Yeah, and matured in an oak vessel not exceeding 700 liters. The oak is generic as far as it needs to be oak. Okay, fine. So it can be
Quercus Gariana.
Oak, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't specify new. It doesn't specify used. It doesn't specify charred. It doesn't specify any of that. And I like that non-specific language.
Yes. That was the most exciting thing for me, is not the 100% malted barley, which is the minimum definition of the category of single malt as far as I'm concerned, but the fact that they adopted the any type of oak cask you want. Doesn't have to be new, doesn't have to be charred. And we don't even have the bifurcation like bourbon versus corn whiskey, completely separate Venn diagrams on cask types between those whiskeys. This is inclusive of all the types. That's what allows for so much diversity in this category. All these different cask types that don't have to start with new oak. You can start with new oak. There is actually an overlap in the Venn diagram between American malt whiskey that happens to be 100% barley, and American single malt whiskey that happens to be aged in a new oak cask.
So
Okay.
we're talking
New
about
charred oak.
can we lobby TTB to add in a stipulation that you cannot age American single malt with Amberana? Can we just get that?
No, I'm hoping so. I'm hoping we can do that.
Yeah, Amberana, no. Well, as long as we keep the oak casks, we don't have to worry about that. But if we relax the cask type, we should at least say they're within. I don't know.
But I,
So-
I
way can
think
you be
Amberana
fair?
is a genus of oak somewhere, somehow. I think that.
No, it's
I
not.
Think it's
I think
that.
it's-
It was not. Okay.
I think it's a completely different family of tree.
Yeah,
So-
Completely different genus of tree. Sorry.
it may be generically referred to as Brazilian oak, but it is not oak.
It is not. Okay. That may be where I'm getting confused at then. because
So-
of that.
The other fun thing, and Jake, you may have more insight on this, is one of the reasons why white oak is the oak of choice for bourbon barrels and liquid holding barrels in general is because, I mean,
Hold on. I want to talk about that. I have posted that in a bunch of places already. I may have already posted it in the video description. If I didn't, I'm going to. So part of what we're doing here today is we're asking you to write to the TTB. There are 2 topics of interest. The main one is write in support of American single malt whiskey. There's a link for it. It's like 2 clicks, fill in your name and email address and hit send. Put your name behind American single malt definition as proposed. The second thing is anything related to direct to consumer and the USPS shipping alcohol, which are sort of under the same Spirits United heading. And you have to click through a bunch of prompts to actually get to the appropriate thing for your state, because this is a state's rules thing. You have to do the right thing for your state and put your letter writing to the appropriate purpose depending on where you are. The USPS is a federal thing, but the direct to consumer thing is the really important bit there. It has to be allowed to ship direct to consumer to get rid of all those extra 3-tier system taxes and fees. And to even make it a question of whether USPS can do it. So go do the letter writing thing. That's what we're here to talk about.
For sure. Jeff has a great comment here. And I don't disagree with it at all. However, the 3-tier system does have a benefit. It's detrimental in some, beneficial in some, and it's hard to say just get rid of it. Modify it, sure.
I want to add in, oddly enough, so I found out earlier this week that I'm going to be speaking at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival this year. And the topic that I'm going to be speaking on is the historic origin of the 3-tier system. So just kind of a quick little summary here. So today, 2024, the 3-tier system seems maybe pointless at times. If anyone is listening and isn't really familiar with the 3-tier system distribution, in short, it has been a policy that has been in place since 1934 and largely unchanged since 1934. It says that you cannot own more than one of the production, the distribution, or the retail. Now, that seems a little pointless today at times, but it's also important to understand why it was put in place in general. So pre-Prohibition, saloon culture was in fact a problem. It was detrimental to America. But what we had pre-Prohibition was it was frequently called a tied house system. Big breweries were the culprits, mainly. You would have these big breweries who would themselves purchase bars or saloons. They would own the saloon themselves. And because they were a big behemoth, they could control the price. And they would make their beer very, very cheap and engage in practices to encourage unhealthy spending and unhealthy consumption, which was in fact problematic to America. It was problematic to families. So that's what you get with the tied house system when you have people who own the production who are also owning the retail. So as Prohibition was coming to an end, and it was clear that it was a failure and that Prohibition was going to be repealed, John D. Rockefeller of that Rockefeller family said, look, if we're going to repeal Prohibition, we need to figure out how to do this the right way. What is the best way to reintroduce alcohol to not bring back the pre-prohibition saloon model, which was indeed problematic? And what they came up with was, to end the tied house system, was this 3-tier system. The 3-tier system prevented the legitimately problematic pre-prohibition saloon model from coming back, and it has been successful in doing that. But a lot of time has passed since then. We're in 2024. We have internet sales, and we have the greatest, ability to ship packages than ever before. So yes, there was very much a legitimate, bona fide reason for the existence of the 3-tier system, but it might need to be altered in 2024 and beyond.
I think modification is definitely needed for the 3-tier system. Abolishment, no, absolutely not, because you will get companies that own the distillery, then they will buy the distribution, and then they will really do some shady things.
Well, and even not just from the saloon culture point of view, but also from a business perspective. If Anheuser-Busch owns their brewery and the 3 bars in town, and they drop the price on a pint to $1.99, and none of the other bars in town can afford to do that, they push the other bars in town out of business, and then they can jack up the prices, and they can push everybody else out, and then they run every establishment that sells alcohol in town. And they set the prices, they set availability, and they decide who can come in and who can't. So from a business perspective, yeah.
It's kind of like a local version of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's creating a local trust for beer and spirits.
All right, I don't know about you guys, but I finished my first drink. What are we moving on to? I think I'm gonna pour the Solom First Edition, which is made with Pacific Northwest peat, which is one of the most unique things that American Single Malt has brought to the world. And it shows the diversity of what you can do with smoke when you leave aside the assumption that Scottish peat is the thing.
Solom 1, you say?
Yes. Well, I can bring out Solom 2 if you want Solom 2.
I got
Okay. Phil, did I send you a sample of Solom 1? I think
Nope.
so.
Or 2.
Oh, no?
Yes, I only have 2.
Okay.
Is there 3 or is there 2?
There are 2 so far.
Yeah, okay. So I had both.
One of the potentially newest American single malt releases on the market. It's the World Whiskey Society Wyatt Earp. It's distilled in Oklahoma, which I think is pretty cool. And I really like it. So it's distilled in Moore, Oklahoma. A brand that most people don't know about, but it's quality.
So as someone who graduated from UT Austin, I have to say, OU still sucks. But besides that, I'm really happy to see that Oklahoma is joining the ranks of American Single Malt, because I mean, I want to have an American Single Malt from every state. That at some point became my mission. It's surprisingly hard to get some of them because a lot of them only distribute very locally.
Yes.
In some ways, the only way you can get these whiskeys is by being a podcaster where the distillery actually sends you the samples.
I have that same goal, Doug. I would love one from every state.
I'm not specifically looking for a single malt from every state, but I am 16 states into having a whiskey from every state. So I'm making progress.
No rest until we get Guam.
You know what, Travis? That's a really good point. Not that I want any of the things that I drink to become more expensive, but as long as we're messing with the 3-tier system, could we at least be consistent?
That also goes back to the quasi-moral belief that beer and wine are inherently different than hard spirits. Despite the fact that you can still consume equal amounts of absolute alcohol, even pre-prohibition, while the dry forces were mobilizing, you had the liquor interest and the beer interest who could have cooperated together to fend off the prohibition forces. But honestly, the beer industry said, well, we're different than the liquor industry. They're just going to take in the liquor industry and they're going to leave us alone because we're wholesome. Even when prohibition was repealed, what was passed first was a repeal on 3.2% beer. The repeal on liquor came later because people have always seen morally a difference in fermented spirits and distilled spirits.
Yeah. A couple of comments here. So Jeff, just to follow up. This is Colorado Whiskey Guy, by the way. Hi, Jeff. Glad to have you in the audience.
Hey, Jeff.
So the government's not in a rush to ask you your opinion, but I have never felt like I'm doing my part in the democratic system more than when I was writing as an activist for the American single malt whiskey definition. Giving your well-reasoned and passionate feedback to the government, to the lawmakers who are actually able to make changes on your behalf, is actually one of the best ways you can participate in government. Besides just voting yes or no and one person versus another, tell your representatives what you want. So follow those links that I posted in chat to the Spirits United campaigns. Write in support of direct-to-consumer. Write in support of USPS carrying alcohol. Write in support, most importantly, for the definition of American single malt whiskey. Thank you.
And I would also add that nobody asking for my opinion has never stopped me from sharing it anyway. And frankly, I don't see why it should stop anybody else.
Bye, Jeff.
Night.
Hey, Jeff.
I don't know if he actually heard that whole thing because he said goodnight 2 minutes ago.
Oh.
I'll send him a message later that I actually responded to his comment. Nobody likes activists. You know, it depends on what you're an activist about. I think I really do truly believe that. I'll leave it there. I don't want to get political.
No, please no.
I want a Pirate Bay from every state.
It's a shot at Marshall.
Yeah, I know. So, Marshall, you want a rum from every island. There's a lot of islands. Do you narrow that scope at all to like rum producing islands?
Tangiers Island in the Chesapeake Bay that is under 10 square miles or something and has under 100 residents.
Okay.
Well,
Let's right this ship a little bit and get the train
Okay.
on the tracks. So there's a label that we want to talk about, but before we get to that, I want to address the elephant in the room. Why is it not okay for these American single malt whiskey producers who've been making what they call American single malt whiskey according to their own agreement of what makes what to just continue doing that? Clearly it's working fine for them so far. Right. This is an argument that I hear. I could make an entire point here. What's your reaction, guys, to that?
I think to gain maybe not even credibility locally, but if we want American single malt whiskey to gain credibility on the world stage, I think it's important that we match their, at least as far as the grain is concerned, their definition of what a single malt is grain-wise to be considered on the world stage.
I'm sorry. Love you, Marshall. Why do we need to put a label on it? So clingy.
I agree with Jake. I think that the end game here, the end goal for maybe majority of the producers in the Single Malt Whiskey Commission, I think their end game, as far as a business goes, is to be on the global market. And in order to play in the global market, you need to have this is what it is, right? There's no bending here. Like, it has to be this to be called this. And if you want to play on the global market, you're going to have to do that. Japan recently, ratified their definitions to be called Japanese whiskey. And as we know, there were some very shady things that happened until that happened. and they're still going to deal with the consequences for several years down the road. But at least at this point in time, moving forward, we know that Japanese whiskey is going to be Japanese whiskey.
Right. They're
And-
a great example. Go ahead, Phil.
The other thing is that the reason why the standard is important and why having American single malt whiskey means something is important is because it presents a standard that the community, the whiskey buying public in general, will see and understand and have a good knowledge of what that means. That they can look at this bottle of Whiskey Del Bach from Lost Lantern, see American single malt whiskey, and know immediately that that means that it's 100% malted barley, that it's from a single distiller. That is the key. And if you don't have standards that are enforced, you get a diffusion of what it means and a reduction in trust from the public in the industry. So if you don't have a standard that everybody is held to, and American single malt whiskey means different things depending on the distiller or depending on the region in the US, then you run into problems with, when a consumer picks up this bottle of McCarthy's and sees American single malt whiskey, they've got to go, okay, well, let's see, what does it say? What is, and now they're reading the back of the label, not out of interest, but out of necessity to see what single malt means in the context of this whiskey, and not necessarily being able to identify on the surface at a glance what type of whiskey this is.
Right. Should have highlighted you sooner, but I'll highlight my bottle as well. So
Yeah.
That bottle that Phil was just showing is a modernized label, but several years ago when this whiskey was released initially, they couldn't say, they still can't say single malt whiskey, right? That's not a category that you're allowed to put on a label according to the TTB right now. It would be nice if you could. What they had to write before, and what they still have to write some version of now, is McCarthy's is a brand. Oregon single malt is a fanciful style that doesn't have any legal standing. Single barrel cask strength whiskey. Notice whiskey is in a completely different font and color. That is the category of this whiskey. And if you really want to know, read the fine print. Distilled from a fermented mash of peat malted Scottish barley, barrel aged a minimum of 3 years. That's not sexy.
American single malt sounds way better.
Yeah, I think we can all agree about that.
Yes, I agree. Travis, yes, that is spot on, sir. Spot on.
A group of gentlemen with questionable standards, if any. Well,
look, I wouldn't be single if I didn't have standards. Just saying.
Cheers to that.
But
Marco, yes,
so-
I totally agree with that. Money does make the laws at the end of the day. Obviously, Kentucky is going to be stuck on bourbon for probably any portion of the foreseeable future. However, there has been some rather nice single malts that came out of Kentucky, and especially recently.
Yep.
So I feel that there's maybe a slight shift happening in the next 5 years from Kentucky. Not that they're going to get rid of bourbon or that bourbon is going to take a back seat, but they are going to add to what they do.
Yeah, Ryan. So right now, you can't call any whiskey American single malt whiskey on one line. That's not a category that exists. So if you try to do that, the TTB will say no. That's why we want the definition. Right now, American single malt whiskeys fit into one of two categories. Either it's the catch-all whiskey category that has no other more specific definition, or it is malt whiskey because it was aged in a new oak cask for the appropriate length of time, new charred oak cask, right? And it's made from at least 51% barley, malted barley, which happens to be in this case 100% malted barley. So it's either whiskey or malt whiskey, or even straight malt whiskey, but not American single malt whiskey. That category doesn't exist yet. That's what we want everyone to write them. Make it happen.
When a label says American single malt on it, it is just additional words on the label that do not pertain to what
So
the,
again,
what the TTB actually approved.
And even on this newer label, there is a separation both in color and size between American single malt and whiskey. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that there is a little bit of bending of rules from people on labeling in this aspect. There are lots of people who are putting single malt whiskey and managing to squeak through TTB with it being the same font or on the same line. But strict letter of the law, there is no American single malt whiskey standard.
yes.
As far as the inconsistency, I think it's also important to realize like it is just a couple of people sitting at the TTB. Like there's inconsistency. That is something that I definitely see all the time. Labels get approved that don't meet standards. I post
Absolutely.
labels frequently, and lots of comments come with it saying, just like for a big one is it's supposed to say state of distillation. I see labels frequently that are clearly not distilled in the state where it says it's produced, but it doesn't list state of distillation. I have received bottles in the mail that actually got the labels got printed and went to market, and it doesn't say that. One of them, strikingly, is a brand called Oak Pack or Oak Packer, and the brand is produced in California. The gimmick is they proof down with rainwater. The label says that it's produced in California, but has no state of distillation. Now, based on the TTB standards, that would mean that this was distilled in California. But when you ask them, they won't acknowledge where it came from. So yeah, things get approved by TTB all the time that should not be approved, and they go to market.
Oh yeah, there's while we're naming names, Tarnished Truth. I was very briefly blocked by them on Twitter because a few years ago I had some questions about their Tarnished Truth High Rye Bourbon because it says finished and bottled by, but there's no language on the rest of the label to indicate that it's finished in anything, and it didn't say that it was distilled in Indiana, but its mash bill was 6036-4, and that's one of the off-the-shelf MGP, and it took weeks of poking them and sending them an email that they never responded to before they said that it was distilled in Indiana and it wasn't finished in anything, but that was their language for having blended it and bottled it in Virginia, which shouldn't have made it through the TTB, but it did because things get through the crack all the time.
Yeah.
And there are also cases of a brand will submit something, it gets denied by a certain person, they resubmit the exact same label, and the next week a different person sees it and it gets approved. So just because something gets approved and it goes to market definitely doesn't mean that meets regulation.
Right. And one of my favorite little tiny things that some brands do really well, like on the bottom of this, you'll see that it's got a distillery DSP and a bottler DSP on it because it's a bottle and bond product. Some bottle and bond products don't have any DSPs on them, and they're supposed to.
Well, yeah, that seems like an oversight because if it's bottled and bonded, it should definitely have the DSP on it.
Yeah. To the letter of the law of the Bottle and Bond Act.
Great comment. I agree. I think the actual distiller of the liquid should have the DSP on the lid. And whether or not they put where it is, what state it is, doesn't matter. If you put the DSP on the lid, which actually would give away the state, but at least if you want to know, you can look it up. If you don't care, you don't have to.
I'm going to play devil's advocate to that, though, with why they shouldn't do that. Not saying I'm right, but just, all right, so let's say that you are a distillery and you put your whiskey on the sourced market. You know what you can personally control as far as the reputation of your whiskey. Your barrels go to a blender who isn't good at blending, and they take your whiskey and they botch it. They take your whiskey and they don't do it justice, and then somebody takes this product that they botched and they assume this is what this distillery produces. That distillery is ruined. So by not requiring the DSP and within NDPs, it can be looked at as those brands are protecting their house integrity.
I get that point actually very well. Yeah, and yeah, Lost Lantern. Obviously, I'm a fan of Lost Lantern. And it's not a secret, but they've run into some issues where, you know, companies didn't necessarily want them to put their name on it, but for the most part, everybody has been overwhelmingly happy to put their name on their bottles. And as they've grown and become better at, you know, what they're doing, everybody's getting more on board with it. But yeah, to your point, if a crap blender gets a hold of some of your stuff and then mixes it poorly, yeah, your distillery is going to be tarnished. Which
I want to know. I mean, I absolutely want to know who distilled what's in my bottle. But yeah, I mean, you're putting your house reputation in the hands of another blender who may not do your whiskey justice, and then you develop a bad reputation based upon their poor blending skills.
Yeah, it's the same thing with, we're all Scotch fans here, right? It's the same thing with Scotch where independent bottlers don't always put the name of the distillery. And that sometimes comes down to contracts, right? Consumers, some consumers want to know the distillery. A lot of consumers don't care. And some distilleries really don't want some third-party brand that was able to buy their whiskey to be able to say it came from them, right? Highland Park is famous.
Unnamed Orkney distillery,
right?
Oh
yeah, probably Highland
Scapa.
Park.
It is never Scapa.
It's never.
Nobody could be, right? And now there's 2 other distilleries on Orkney, so you know it's getting the field is getting thinner, but still, probably Highland Park doesn't want their name to be on a lot of independent bottlings. Also, welcome to the chat, Bartolome. Thank you for joining.
Yay!
Hey.
Current master distiller of my first favorite American single malt, I should say. Would love to hear the group's opinion on QR codes on labels. There's only so much real estate on a bottle.
Chuck the QR code on it. The people interested will scan it. The people not interested look right past it.
So I have devil's advocate on this one.
Okay.
My favorite coffee locally, Boon Boona, who I've had on this show, recently changed their bags from listing everything directly on the label to putting a QR code on the label instead. I think the instead was a mistake. Scanning the QR code is an extra hurdle I have to do to know what's in my bag now. I don't like that. I like it for extra information, but there's another problem. Accessibility and just equity, right? It's at this point, it's taken as an assumption that everyone has a smartphone. It's not actually a fair assumption. You would say for the most part, these are luxury products. You probably have a smartphone, but maybe it's a safe assumption. But I think if you're requiring people to scan a QR code to get to the extra information, that's a mistake. I think if you put a QR code on the label, there should also be a URL that could be typed in, because a QR code is basically just a URL. And I know that defeats the bottle real estate thing. But I guess what I'm saying is it shouldn't be necessary to scan the QR code. As long as it's not necessary to scan the QR code, I support it. I think all the same information that's on the bottles today should stay on the bottles.
Oh, for sure. But like the
I have not often been accused of being old, but I suppose I'm dressed that way today.
Look, I have been a curmudgeon since high school. My opinion on QR codes hasn't changed since they became popular, which I'm thinking back, I think was after I graduated from high school, but the point stands. I don't like having to use my phone as an interface because I don't always have good service. One of my favorite ABC stores to drop by when I'm in the area is out in an area where I don't have reliable service. And if the only access to the information on the label that I would like to read is through a QR code that you need internet access to see, and that the distillery has to maintain a URL for, and a essentially maintain a website to house that information.
Yeah, there's
That
definitely
does get fragile for sure.
there's
As someone who
definitely
works in tech,
logistics there that need to
I
be.
like lots of information. I fully understand that you can't fit all that information on the label, but I think you are. I don't like the aesthetics of them. I don't know. Like, I want, as much as I care about the quality of the whiskey, I want it to look attractive. And I don't think QR codes on whiskey labels are attractive. And maybe that's a petty thing. I don't like it.
you know, I'm not going to read that out loud. If you want to know what we're laughing at, watch the video.
No, so yeah, I mean, there's places to put a QR code that are inconspicuous. Spicy said on the top of the cap, that's great. On the bottom of the bottle, also great.
Mm-hmm.
Right next door to the UPC code, which has to be on there, which I think is no more aesthetically pleasing than anything else.
Just ship this
how
over.
tiny they made this one.
There's
definitely.
And
there are things. Also, the surgeon's warning and all this other stuff. Like, there's stuff
we know it's not great, and we shouldn't drink it while we're pregnant. And
that's what the back label's for. All the ugly stuff.
But the facts of the matter is there is some distilleries that are doing it. I like I have that single cask of Virginia that has the thing. Now there was a disconnect because Phil, what you said, they have to maintain that information somewhere, right? Like it's a maintenance thing. They have to keep it up, and it didn't show me what my bottle was like. It had 5 options, and my bottle was not one of the options. So there was a disconnect there. The concept of it, I thought, was really good. Scotch distilleries, I believe, is it Ardnamurchan that's doing that? That has been fairly successful with it so far.
But Ryan Legend says he's found issues with Ardnamurchan's QR tokens. So I'd love for you to elaborate if you want.
And I don't have any of that, so I can't verify firsthand, but I knew they were doing that.
Actually, so yeah, let's dig into that last part of that comment. So Bruichladdich bottle/batch code works really well. Bruichladdich does have to maintain that information in a way that you can access it, or you don't get access to that information anymore. But because it's something you have to go to their website and type in a code, they can move it to a different URL, whatever, without breaking your ability to find that information. If Tyler's still here, I will put in my hat. I will put my vote in that the releases that have been retired should still have accessible pages of the details, because there have actually been multiple occasions now where I've reviewed a bottle of Westland whiskey and copied the full spec sheet into my review because it was interesting, not because I thought I would need it in my review, right? I could happily link off to their website, which I also did, right? That link broke at some point. And the only I was at a bottle share party. Someone else at the party brought the same bottle that I had reviewed, wanted to look up the details, searched on Google, and found my review as the only result that had the technical specs. Because I was one of the only reviews, and Westland's page had been taken down. So yes, put that extra information out there, but make sure that it stays alive.
I picked up this bottle long after they stopped using this label, this nomenclature.
Yep.
After they changed how they make this whiskey. If they had a little QR code on there that led to their website after they discontinued it, and if they stopped supporting that information on their website, it would have led to a 404 code probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a technical person, I find it I am compelled to point out a QR code is literally just a text encoding. It's just like zeros and ones. Humans can't read it, but it's actually really straightforward. So, yeah. But I think you might be referring to the thing where you can put your brand logo in the middle of a QR code to make it a little less ugly. I support that for sure.
But
If you're doing that,
this is informational stuff. And obviously some people want more information than what's readily available or what people are willing to give. I, for one, would like all the information, and I think Westland does one of the best jobs about that I've seen, as far as the amount of information that they'll give you. And some are very much less than that. But
so Patricia,
trying to rein
I don't
this
know
back to
we should. Yeah, this is the problem with a live stream is we tend to go off into the weeds with chat
Well,
sometimes and we have to force ourselves back.
That's great.
Patricia, I love the idea. I don't know where the money is in it, but I will say that Whiskey Base does a pretty damn good job with community sourced bottle information. So whiskey-base.com, whiskey with no E on that one. I recommend that. It's a lot of old bottles I can only find there, and it works for a lot of them. But actually, the longer you're a whiskey reviewer, the more you find you're reviewing things that don't exist on Whiskey Base. You're the only person who's ever reviewed something. That's actually kind of a cool feeling. Part of it is like, is this going to be useful to anyone? I'm reviewing one of 200 bottles of something. It doesn't have a listing anywhere. Who's going to care?
54.
Right. The Delbach.
So Doug, we have a picture of a label that is labeled single malt whiskey. That is clearly not single malt whiskey, nor does it fit into any definition of single malt whiskey.
Yep. All right. So yeah, let's talk about this. So why we want
and why the category being standardized is beneficial, and this is a detriment to it.
Right. So this is probably not. I could almost say for certain this is not the only example. So we're not trying to pick on specifically this, but this was a very conspicuous example because they were so front and center, right? Yeah. This almost violates the different font rule as well, right? I mean, single malt whiskey, they are technically on different lines.
I feel violated with this label.
Yeah, it does. It does certainly violate. It offends the senses, right? So, okay. So Fluger single malt whiskey. Aside from the fact that different lines and like maybe same font and whatever, like right now, when I first saw this bottle label, I was like, oh, cool. I know where Pflugerville is. I lived in Texas. They're making a single malt whiskey. Cool. Let's read the details. And you get to the bottom of the details, and that is staring you in the face. Grain bill, 80% malted barley, 20% rye. This is not a single malt. But there is no protection right now for the term single malt in American whiskey. So they've done nothing wrong.
Right.
And that's a problem.
That's the problem right there. Because now somebody will pick that up and be like, oh, this is horrible. And I will never have another American single malt.
So yes. I think the bigger, standard wise, they've done nothing wrong. But the bigger question is, but still, why did they do it? Like, there's like, it's why? Like, what is their motivation?
I have an answer for that.
100% Texan is a very Texan sentiment. I will say that.
Yeah. I have an answer to your question. The reason is to trade in on the cachet of single malt whiskey, which is popular, not just, with the rising category in the United States, and the push for ratification of these standards and therefore greater attention on American single malt whiskey, but also because single malt whiskey is overseas the standard. It's what people look for. And if you're familiar with single malt Scotch, that will grab your attention. I would also like to point out that that everything in their write-up is marketing nonsense, and almost none of it has any value.
And
That's also true.
To add to your point, Phil, if you look at that bottle one more time,
Yes,
and just look at the bottle itself,
the bottle. Yes,
the similarity to another Texas single malt that is actually doing very good in bottle shape.
yes.
Yes.
Is very uncanny. So there is definitely a try to cash in on something aspect here, and I've never had the whiskey, so I cannot trash the whiskey. I don't know about it.
It's just open deception.
I've seen a comment or two that it's actually pretty bad, but I don't know firsthand. I am trashing the label. I think it's very crappy that they did what they did. And I
This is
think
not
it's even
exactly
worse
the bottle you were thinking of.
Prove that.
This is a taller.
That's
version
that's a new style bottle.
Yep.
This is the old style bottle, Doug. So
Yes.
Yep.
So I mean,
Yes, absolutely.
dead on.
Hey, I've
similar.
got that one.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, in their defense of bottle shape, that is the default bottle shape.
Sure,
basically.
fine, but why would you pick that and put? It just adds to the. It adds to the shadiness of it for me.
Yeah, it's just open deception.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here, a couple more comments. So yeah, the problem with the 100% Texan thing, it's a marketing gimmick. However, I would be interested to know whether the Texas whiskey is trying to make their own regional designation of a sort that Texas whiskey distilleries opt into and get a badge on the bottle and all that sort of stuff. I don't know the full details on that. I used to know it better, but that's not like my main focus, so I kind of lose track of it. I wonder if they comply with that. That would be interesting. I would hope not.
I would wager not.
And yeah, malt whiskey is not single malt. That's a really key issue that we want the standard to address. And yeah, that distillery may have.
But that and that label clearly says single malt, and it is not.
Yes,
Okay,
it's the most egregious violation of good sense when it comes to American single malt that I know of.
It's open deception, but
yes,
if they're playing semantics based on American standards, it is a malt whiskey because it's at least 51%, and it's from a single distillery. So it's definitely playing semantics, but it is a malt whiskey from a single distillery. It just doesn't meet. They know what they're doing.
Yes, they do know what they're doing. They are playing the fact that American single malt doesn't actually mean anything. The word single malt in America doesn't mean anything until you're talking about the imported product.
Right.
And so, they're playing that big time. And it's crappy.
Yeah, absolutely.
They could have easily put on the label a very unique American whiskey with 80% barley and 20% rye. I mean, I would try that, but I will not try that because it says single malt on it and it clearly states that it's not. And I would try it if somebody gave it to me. I'm not
right. Yeah,
but I'm not going to go buy it.
We're at an interesting moment now. I want to bring this back to it has been more than 2 years that this definition has been sitting, awaiting ratification. That there is basically no debate about the bare minimum specifications of this rule, right? It's a sentence and an entry in a table. It's dead simple, easy. They make broader changes to the standards identity document than that, just in the course of changing the verbiage. And they're not getting around to approving this. And meanwhile, American single malt is having a year it's getting very popular. It's getting a lot of attention now. Second half of 2023 through now, I would say. It's got the public consciousness. It's only a matter of time until we see dozens of violations of this sort that will erode the category. And also those labels will be grandfathered in probably to some extent, right? You have to use up your existing stock of that product before you're compelled to change the label. Jake can probably speak with more certainty on that fact. So the more of
I
these
thought
things
there
we
was
allow to
stipulation
happen.
for that.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jerm.
I thought there was a stipulation for that, like you'll have a certain period of time to fix the product or change the label.
Right. And the point is, it's not immediately. So the more of these labels that we allow into existence, the longer this definition doesn't get ratified in some bare minimum form. If they have to change it somehow in a way that could be adapted later, okay, I wouldn't be super happy with that. I like the definition as it is. I think everybody who's producing the stuff likes the definition as it is. You would ruin a lot of people who make legitimate American single malt. As far as my personal opinion on legitimacy for American single malt, if you forced a new charred oak requirement, so I don't support that, but put some bare minimum definition into the law to protect the term single malt for whiskeys made in America, so that this doesn't happen. We are at a dangerous precipice now of seeing a lot more of this because American single malt has become popular. You can charge a premium for it, and a lot of consumers don't know they're being deceived.
Right. And for anybody watching that doesn't buy a lot of American single malt or doesn't pay attention to it a lot and is curious about it, if you check out the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission's website, you can get a list of the producers that support and distill to those standards and make whiskey in those standards. So you know you're getting at least a quality American single malt, even if the definition isn't there yet. Like they're making it to what we want the definitions to be.
Yeah. Okay. There's one more thing I want to talk about. Hopefully the topic is brief because we're already at 2 hours. This definition draws lines. Let me bring up the definition again, just for completeness. This definition draws some lines. By the very nature of drawing lines, it does leave out some, what you might argue are legitimate American single malts that happen to violate some technical detail, like, say, distillation proof. And Germ has brought up exactly the example I was going to give. Brother Justice, or Brother Eustace, I'm not sure. Is it Brother Justice?
I call it Brother Justice. I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't spoken with him to
So
clarify.
Brother Justice is a delicious product. The cold peated whiskey. I had my doubts when I read about it initially, and when I heard, oh, they are not part. They technically are left out of the boundary that's drawn by this definition because their distillation proof is technically higher than 160 proof. That is the reason. And and he's rightfully indignant. And I spent 2 hours talking to him, impassioned, at the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission meeting in Denver this past February. Great guy, super passionate, delicious whiskey. Unfortunately, falls outside of the line of this definition, and I don't necessarily support that because I think it's oak containers of some description. I don't remember exactly.
Why does he fall out of the qualifications for ASM?
His distillation proof is higher than
Distillation proof.
Yeah, okay. I thought that was never mind. I missed
Yeah.
missed
It's
that.
distillation.
What I believe that currently, under current standards, his whiskey doesn't fall into any neat categories because of his distillation proof.
What was that, Jake?
What?
Are they aging in new cooperage or used?
A mix, I think, but I don't actually know.
Okay.
As far as I know, this is new and it's very young. So it's a very short period of time in smaller new oak barrels. From what I gather, he does like cuts throughout the entire distillation process. So at some points in time, he's well above 160.
Yeah.
But, there are a few outliers, but if we're trying to establish an American style, I do like the idea of an American style of distillation proofs. that is something that can differentiate us as a national identity.
Right.
Yeah.
If we're trying to establish something for the greater good or some language like that, there are going to be outliers. And
Right.
at some point, I think it's important just to say, this is our style. And if you're on the outside, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think what happened there to some extent, and I'm going to invite him on the show because I really would like to have a public version of the debate that we had, which I thought was a great conversation. I think some version of what happened, and this is just my surmising, was what he was making did not cleanly fit into any category anyway. So he said, I'm gonna make what works, what tastes good, no matter what, because it already doesn't fit into anything. So don't worry about trying to fit into any of the other rules, right? And as I mentioned before, this rule about 160 proof maximum distillation proof, that's an American thing. That's not an extra restriction on American single malt. It's merely the fact we're not changing the restriction in the definition of American single malt, right? Yeah. And as Travis pointed out, I'm sorry, this one. As Travis pointed out, 160 proof distillation for single malt is actually kind of low on the world stage. So the distiller whose name is escaping me right now, I apologize. Phil Steger, was it? I think so. His contention that I've heard in an interview that I can't find now, which is frustrating, was that he was distilling with something that was in line with the world definition of single malt on distillation proof. He's not excessively over 160. He's like around 163, 165, something like that. It's very close. But he technically falls outside the line, and that's unfortunate. And he's tried bringing it down, is what he tells me. He's tried bringing it down to 160, and it doesn't taste the same. So as for that cold peated product specifically, it doesn't work unless he does what he does. It's not the same product. I have to take that at face value because I'm not a distiller and I'm not the one making his product. I think it's a valid argument. And the fact that if it was bad whiskey, I wouldn't passionately defend it. But the fact is it's good whiskey, and it's a shame that it's left out of the definition. However, I wouldn't block this definition because certain really good whiskey is left out of it. I would say his adjacency to American single malt will still work in his favor. Mm-hmm. And I want this definition on the books because we need something.
Right.
And Travis's other comment I also wanted to respond to. I think we should do a minimum age statement of 2 years on it.
No.
I think there should be a category that has a minimum age statement of 2 years on it, and it should be straight American single malt whiskey.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're getting at. And yes, I agree. They could differentiate. I don't think single malt from here needs a minimum age because obviously we've had great products from 11 months old. Mm-hmm. We've had great products at 12 years old. We've had great products at 4 years old. We've had, so the minimum I don't think needs to be there. But if you want to do a straight American single malt and put a minimum of 2 years on it to keep it in line with the rest of the stuff that's been coming out previously, fine. But I think that's an extra step that doesn't need to be taken.
Yep. While we are on the subject of things that fall either inside or just outside of the definition, I want to bring up Copper Fox again, because they do something that is slightly unique. They age in barrels, and they also have wood chips or wood blocks that are put into the barrels in a mesh bag suspended from the top of the barrel. And it has been implied that with the standards adopted, they would no longer qualify as single malt whiskey. But I am not sure that he technically falls outside of the boundaries because they are still aging in a barrel. Mm-hmm. They just have the addition of the bundle of charred fruit wood that is inserted into the barrel.
Well, I mean, it's Maker's Mark. I mean, Maker's Mark. I mean, Private Select. They have inserts. I mean,
yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
where like there is some contention from people who, I don't want to say they're fear mongering, but are trying to say, oh, if this is ratified, then there are going to be whole distilleries or lots of distilleries that are left out in the cold. When, for example, Copper Fox, who are doing something very different, will be included, I think, in the standards.
I see no reason not to. I mean, as long as they are
Yeah.
spending some time in a barrel,
Mhm.
I mean, who
hmm
I certainly don't care if they have some inserts inside the barrel. It's
Yeah.
in a barrel. As long as
Yeah.
they're transparent
And
about it, and they are.
yeah,
They're very transparent about it.
I will say I love their labels. I know not everybody does, but they add so much information.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
their new label for those who aren't familiar. This
Yeah.
is not the standard classic single malt. This is the standard Peachwood smoked release. I don't actually have a bottle of the classic standard single malt from them at the moment.
And
Yeah,
I
I
have
don't
a
do that.
single barrel, same thing. Hopefully this shows up better on the video. But the point is it's a lot of fine print, right? And I don't know how much of that is unique to this bottle versus that's just their general process of having
I think we got
that
the same one,
particular
Doug.
the seal box.
Yes.
Oh, it's really good, isn't it?
It's
With the
the
port
port
style.
style barrel.
Yeah.
Yeah, that thing is good. So,
Yeah, okay. So that's the end of my questions, I think. Any other topics y'all want to cover, or should we sort of ease our way out?
So, do we
one
want
more
to
question. Go ahead. Phil.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Yours is probably more on
gonna
point.
do a wrap up question.
Okay, wrap up question. But first, Phil, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask if we wanted to address some of the, because we've been at this for 2 hours and I've lost track of everything that we've spoken about. The some people's any kind of barrel comments about American single malt standards. There were some people who were saying that you could use any kind of barrel, and there are a couple of limitations. I think has to be oak, and a minimum, or there's a maximum size you can't exceed.
Yes. Do we want to go back to the standards for a moment? Or does it matter? I'm sorry, what's the question?
The question was, did we want to talk about some of the other erroneous statements that have been made about American single malt, such as the you can use any kind of barrel comments and that
Sure.
sort of thing?
I mean,
because
sure. Do you want to address that one specifically?
Well, I mean, not necessarily the size one specifically. Go ahead, Germ.
I said technically at the moment you can use anything and put American single malt on the label and you're all right. But with those definitions, it has to be oak. It has to be less than 700.
Whiskey does at least require a non-zero amount of time in an oak container. The word whiskey on the label does require that as a bare minimum.
Right. So it still has to be oak regardless to say whiskey on it.
Yeah, so I agree. So I've so far avoided I'm sorry, I'm forgetting that some people are just listening. So Ryam Legend says straight malt whiskey is already a legal definition, which could have state designations. Straight American single malt whiskey is wordy and I think distracts from the intention of a standard.
Yeah.
The difference here being malt whiskey versus single malt whiskey. And yes, the full thing, if you wanted to put straight on the label, would be straight American single malt whiskey. We already have finished whiskeys such as Angel's Envy, for example, whose fanciful names are long enough to be on 2 lines, for one thing, where as long as it's the same font, you get away with it. Yeah, let's focus on that one. So you can see
whiskey distilled from a rye mash, whiskey distilled from a malt mash.
Right, and you can see they didn't even try 2
already
lines. They're just like
long
4 lines is fine. Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey finished in port wine barrels on 4 lines, all in the same font. So, we have to do a line break. Okay, that's kind of ugly. Okay, It's wordy. Maybe it distracts from the intention of a standard. I think that sort of boils down to an edge case in the same way as those finished whiskeys, which are technically distilled spirit specialty products. You really get into the weeds when you start getting into those long designations, but they still have a meaning. And what we're looking to protect here is the phrase single malt, right? And all the other words add some nuance, and some people will care and some people won't. But the important thing is if it says single malt, it meets the definition of single malt. If it says straight single malt, it meets the definition of straight single malt. My biggest concern with the definition as written, I've stayed away from this so far. I've done a huge write-up 2 years ago where I tore apart the proposal and broke it down in disgusting detail. It's like 6,000 lines long, 6,000 words long. This article that I wrote, and it's linked in the description. If you really want to see my detailed comments, right? The biggest issue that I had with this standard is the fact that blended malt has a meaning to people who are familiar with the Scotch definition of single malt whiskey. And blended malt has a definition in the United States rules, which has nothing to do with single malt. If you don't have time to read a long designation, you're probably already drunk and don't need to buy more bottles. Not that that ever stopped anybody.
Yeah,
Maybe it stopped some.
Probably
Alcohol abuse is a completely separate problem. We talk about that once a quarter during our dry weeks in the Whiskey Lodge, blah, blah, blah. That's not the point of today's conversation.
Yeah.
Marshall, 100%. There's no issue in these standards. It needs to be more open than bourbon. My concern along the lines of that blended whiskey question is that has potential to be confusing. And the TTB's main function is to avoid confusing the consumer. What does blended malt mean when you have American single malt, a definition on the docket? And how do you indicate a blend of American single malts, which are not a blend of malt whiskeys because they're not aged in new oak? There's a gray area there that's not properly designated right now. This definition allows room to add that in the future. So I added to my comments to the TTB, I think you need to be considering this question, but don't block this designation on answering it.
Yeah. And good comment.
And no matter what, no matter how simple we made it, it took 2 years and we still haven't ratified it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to ask my exit question,
Obviously, this has been a conversation about American single malts. And as we know, craft distillers have been making American single malts for, upwards near 25, 30 years now.
Since the 90s, 94, 96, McCarthy's.
Yeah, right there. But obviously more so lately. What is one distillery that you would like to see produce an American single malt that hasn't done so yet? That hasn't released it yet. Maybe they produced it and it just hasn't come out yet, but that you haven't been able to buy yet.
Okay.
Oh, all right. So are you tossing one that they make it, but it's not readily available yet? Is that what I heard?
Sure, fine.
Right. So Watershed in Columbus, Ohio is making single malt. Two Soul Spirits, an independent bottler, they released it, a year ago? So
yeah, a year ago.
I thought it was crazy good. So Watershed also distills their own apple brandy. I want to say there was a 6-year total age statement on this between initial age and finish, and it's the Watershed single malt finished in a Watershed apple brandy barrel. To my knowledge, Two Souls is the only place that has bottled it, or at least has openly bottled it. Watershed's not released it yet under their own label. I'm ready. Get on it. Amy Willis, if you're watching this with Watershed, make that happen. Give it to us soon. We want Watershed American single malt.
The information I want on that one, Jake, is what did they smoke it with? Because it is smoked.
Yeah.
But they will not tell me what it was smoked with. So that is the information I want. It is good. And I would be totally on board with Watershed coming out with more single malt stuff. So Doug, how about you?
So I'm going to first give my cop-out answer, which is this thing in my hand that I can't identify is a single malt that hasn't hit the market yet that I'm really fucking excited about.
All right.
I will say nothing else. But I'll also answer the question differently. So Few is now owned by Heaven Hill, Few Spirits. As I understand it, I hope I didn't get that wrong. It's one of the big brands anyway. As I understand it, when they were acquired, they discontinued their American single malt. So this is a slightly different answer to the question than maybe you were thinking. They have made an American single malt. It was okay. From what I've heard, I believe I tried. I thought it was pretty good. I've heard from other people it's just okay. I actually think Ryam Legend told me it's just okay. So I have to take that with a grain of salt because I already know he doesn't like young American single malt. They've discontinued it. Whatever still exists is really hard to get, but I think I would like to see them personally. I feel this is a pipe dream, probably won't happen. I think if Heaven Hill is going to make an American single malt, it won't be under the Few brand. But I would like to see them bring it back because I've seen Stranahan's. I got a bottle of Stranahan's from 3 years ago. It was pretty good. The yellow label. It was pretty good. Wasn't my favorite. I went to Stranahan's in February and tried their latest stuff. It's so much better. They've improved so much in 2 years since this proposal came out. It was one of the questions that I actually sort of posed as the topic for this conversation. How has the landscape changed in 2 years? So this is a couple of ways. Few no longer makes an American single malt. So we're seeing some people exit American single malt for one reason or another. And single malts that already existed are getting better. The ages are so low on these things that the experimentation, the iterations that they can go through, we're seeing a lot of change and learning and innovation. Things are getting better. So I would have high hopes for what Few is presenting in their spirits right now. If they made an American single malt, I think it would be really, really good stuff. Now, to really answer your question, I want to see Wild Turkey make a single malt.
There we go. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah. So the first bourbon producer that I heard of that had joined the ASMWC in some capacity, maybe just as like they're on the mailing list or whatever, Wild Turkey was one of them, the first one that I heard about. And I said, that makes sense, not because I think they're going to make American single malt, but because they really want to have their finger on the pulse of what the industry is doing. They want to know what American single malt producers are making. However, Jack Daniel's made a single malt. Beam made a single malt. Bullet has a single malt. Not that these are necessarily the best single malts in the world, but Wild Turkey is one of my favorite bourbons, and I would love to. And they have rye, right? They don't make a.
And they make a very good rye.
They make a very good rye. They make a very good bourbon. Why shouldn't they make a very good single malt? They care a lot about their malted barley component of their bourbon. That's one of the things they talk about all the time. Why wouldn't they at least try? And so my conspiracy theory is they have tried it. I don't know if they'll ever release it, but I would not be surprised if in the corner of some warehouse somewhere there are several barrels of American single malt made by Wild Turkey, just as an experiment.
I agree with you that all of them have some somewhere sitting, testing, waiting, trashing the idea, whatever.
Oh.
But
okay, sorry, I misspoke. That bit about Few having American single malt and that they didn't quite like it, that didn't come from Ryan Legend. I apologize. That was somebody else.
So, Phil, you?
Catoctin Creek.
I knew you were going there for some reason.
I have 17 bottles of whiskey from Catoctin Creek. I have Wonder Wheel, Midnight Confession, Harper's Malt, and Colossal X, which are malt whiskeys. They're distilled from beers from local breweries. And I want to see what their 100% barley single malt would be. I think that I would like it, but I also just really like all the rye whiskeys that they produce. And I'm actually pretty fond of a couple of the distilled from beer whiskeys as well, which I was not expecting. I was expecting to not like them terribly much because a couple of them are distilled from IPAs, and I cannot stand IPAs.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough.
But they do a lot of interesting finishing. They've got one of my favorite finished rye whiskeys, which is finished in a hickory syrup barrel. And I managed to snag a bottle of their cask strength maple syrup finish, and I'm pretty sure the barrel that it was aged in.
Very cool.
Because I wanted a barrel.
I think we could probably all agree with this. Travis says, I can tell you who I don't want making American single malt, Buffalo Trace.
I'll be honest with you, and I might be out on an island here, but I could do without them making whiskey, period.
So you did the yes and on that comment.
Yeah. I mean, it could be worse.
No, I don't hate them. I hate the hype.
No, they make good whiskey, but they're catered to high heaven.
If they made it, we'd never see it. We would never see it in the shelf anyway.
Right. It would
be.
be.
I mean, wasn't there a meme image going around of somebody's W.L. Weller 100% barley fake label at one point?
So you know what it would take to make me a Buffalo Trace tater? If Buffalo Trace made an American single malt that was actually good.
That's the key.
That you could actually get.
That or
so less than 10
the
times
tater part is that I would try even if I can't.
My one hot take about Buffalo Trace is I don't think their spirit takes high age statements well. Nobody will ever agree with me.
No,
I like Eagle Rare is incredibly like almost crunchy with the amount of oak in it, and it's as someone who has inhaled so much oak sawdust over the years that I taste oak in my sleep. If I taste it and go, that's a little bit too much oak, that's probably more oak than you really want on a whiskey. And that's only a 10-year-old, and it's their blended release of. Actually, no, it's single barrel, isn't it?
It is.
No,
well, it's very close to being single barrel.
Guaranteed.
It used to be.
It used to be.
Yeah, they cannot guarantee it's all from one barrel.
Yeah, it's not technically single barrel, but single barrel is not a protected term anyway. So
no.
The thing that I'm thinking of is I know someone who has a bottle of Eagle Rare that does say single barrel on it, but it's about 3 label iterations back. Mm-hmm. That's how fast they drink.
Yeah. Well, see Exhibit A. I got this 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So for me, a distillery that I would love to see make American single malt that hasn't yet. My easy answer is all of them. I would love to see every craft distiller, every big distiller make one, and it gets on the map, and everybody's product is different. Some are good, some are bad.
Yeah,
everybody
yeah.
their choice on it.
However, I like the sentiment, but I feel like that would be pretty noisy.
It's not a legitimate request because that actually probably would be bad. But Maker's Mark, I would love to see an American single malt out of Maker's Mark.
Yeah, that would have been my runner.
Oh yeah,
they have a great attention to detail. 2, they spell whiskey the correct way, anyways.
Yeah.
So,
Notice how in the title of this podcast I didn't put the word whiskey. I think spelling the word whiskey is putting your thumb on a scale in a way I didn't want to do with an E or without an E. So I made sure that whiskey was not in the title of this show.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of alternate vowels to put between the K and the Y to make it funny. The only one that came to mind is a U, and I don't know why.
Okay. I think we should just do we should do it like the Russian transliteration way where it's like with an I, right?
Oh yeah. There we go.
Yeah. It's whiskey.
Yeah, there you go.
Well,
Dude,
I think
that would be horrible, Travis. I'm sorry, but that would be horrible.
Oh yeah, no. So Travis says coming soon to a liquor store museum near you. Pappy van down by the river 23-year-old American single malt. Turns out
Yeah,
I like
Buffalo
the
Trace
name.
distilled
I do
American
like the
single malt in the
If I were to
90s.
do an ASM barrel pick, that's the name of the whiskey, Pappy Down by the River.
but
You
the
may
problem
be able
is
to
you
get that
can't
past
afford the
trademarks.
van to live down by the river in anymore.
Well,
They've tatered up all the good vans.
Well, especially after you pay for that bottle of Pappy Down by the River single malt. Did everybody answer that question?
I
lost
think
track.
so.
They did.
Okay, cool.
I came in last.
Well, all right. There's only one last thing I can think of doing, which is my glass is once again empty. And I want to pick a real good one to go out on, or just something that's currently interesting to me. But you know what? I pulled it out. I'll go for it. So my last pour is going to be the quintessential port side. This is a fantastic bottle, and this was the first time that I felt like a proper podcaster when, without question, they were like, yeah, sure, we'll send you samples. And they sent me a box of 3 full bottles. And I said, you didn't have to do that. But that really made me feel special. So,
Oh yeah.
I'm sticking
Bill, what
with
do you
this
have?
for my last glass.
McCarthy's PX 6-year, excellent choice.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
that's a good whiskey.
Also, I'll always throw out a free advertising for them. You can still get that, and they've recently dropped the price down to match the Oloroso if you go to Portland to get it.
So I'm going with the Seattle's Copperworks. This is one of their new permanent series. It is the Farm Smith. It is batched. It is not a single cask like everything else they've done. Each edition is going to feature a specific farm, specific season, and a specific variety of barley. This is Baroness.
And
Awesome.
I'm boring and joined Doug on the port side, although it's fantastic whiskey, so it's not that boring.
That's twice now you've copied me.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Hey, I
you don't
appreciate
want
the
to feel
solidarity.
alone. When you said something special, I was going to grab the notch, but then you said port side. I'm like, yeah, that sounds good.
There's a lot of this stuff that sounds good. Honestly, I hadn't planned on pouring this one, but I very nearly poured Cataleja just because it's
I love
interesting.
It's so crazy that you can thoroughly enjoy so many different whiskeys, and each one of them has their place, and they're all so good.
All right. Well, Germ, I'm going to ask you to sign us off after I give my sign off. So first of all, gentlemen, thank you for joining me. This roundtable has been a lot of fun. I know that this was long and there's a lot of people and opinions to say, but thank you for your patience staying with this for 2.5 hours. To the definition of American single malt being ratified, and to all of you who are watching, please write in. Tell your friends to write in, even if they don't like whiskey. Just if it matters enough to you and all of us, we should be getting all the people in our lives to support this thing that we love. So, to the ratification of the definition of American single malt whiskey. Until next time, we'll see you in the lodge. And Germ, your usual sign off.
My usual
Cheers
sign off. Cheers
to this
To
American
this
spirit. Did I get that right? Yeah.
Yep. Cheers to this American spirit. Cheers, gentlemen.
Sláinte.
People watching, thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.